Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. On behalf of UNICEF, I would like to welcome you to this webinar to present the latest UNICEF estimates on child marriage. We are going to wait a couple of seconds because I see the attendees are coming in. But in the meantime, I would like to flag that interpretation is available in Spanish, French, and Arabic. You're just going to have to click at the bottom of your screen. There is a globe. Interpretation is available there. You can click on the globe and select the language that you prefer. The webinar will be held in English, but again, simultaneous interpretation is available in French, Spanish, and Arabic. My name is Claudia Cappa, and I'm a senior advisor in the Data and Analytics section within the Division of Data Analytics, Planning and Monitoring in UNICEF headquarters. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar and share some initial findings from the publication that UNICEF released on May 3rd, Is an End to Child Marriage Within Reach. It is my pleasure and honor to be joined by a distinguished group of panelists. First, we are going to hear from Vidya Ganesh, who is the Director of the Division of Data Analytics, Planning and Monitoring in UNICEF HQ. I will then share some findings from the publication together with my colleague, Colleen Murray. Colleen Murray is a statistics and monitoring specialist in the Division of Data Analytics, Planning and Monitoring, again, in UNICEF New York. And last but not least, Nankali Maksud, Senior Advisor in the Child Protection Program Group in UNICEF New York, will also join us for some remarks on the programmatic implication of the findings, and she will also moderate the Q&A session that will follow. So, and again, now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Vidya Ganesh for her opening remarks. Thank you, Vidya.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claudia. Dear friends, colleagues, partners who are good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us today, where we are, we'll be talking about the findings of the new global estimates on child marriage, as Claudia just introduced. But I'm particularly happy and pleased to be with you all today, particularly because it's really important that we take this moment to recommit and further strengthen our resolve and partnership to end child marriage. Because the question for the top today that we are posing to ourselves is an end to child marriage within reach. But obviously the answer we want is yes, we can end child marriage. But what do we need to do to make it within reach? It's really I hope what our discussions and inspirations will lead us to. So I really look forward to hearing from all of you what the questions that the data raises for you and what reflections you have and implications of these findings for each of you in your respective areas of work and in your respective context, because that's really important. I don't have to mention to this group, but as we all know, ending child marriage is a commitment, a unique one that was made within the Sustainable Development Goals, falling under Goal 5 on gender equality. And as such, it's an area of work where that cuts across all of the SDGs, and then particularly bringing the focus around the drivers of gender and gender equality. So UNICEF does have the responsibility to be as a custodian agency to monitor progress towards this goal, and that and the process of taking on that responsibility has created an amazing partnership of people who are looking very closely what the numbers are and what they're telling us, but equally about how then do we design our response and scale up, and how do we support each other and really have a global movement, but a very well evidence-based, informed local response that can be scaled and is also sustainable. So it's really with that hope and that strength of that partnership that we have. Let's talk about some findings, and I want to talk about three things in particular, and Claudia and Colleen and Nankali will get into much more details. First of all, the scale of the issue remains massive. Even though there has been progress, we still have 1 in 5 girls worldwide get married before their 18th birthday. There has been continued progress, and we all know, but what the projections are telling us is that we are not on track to meet the SDG target at the current pace. But what was really revealing is not the expectation that we are 300 years away from a world without child marriage. That is something that is quite worrying, and we really need to, and that's not the trajectory that we want to be on. So we have to do something quite dramatic to alter that pace of change. Second, the coming years will continue, over the coming years, we'll continue to look at what are some of the hurdles that are presenting themselves while we are continuing on well-known evidence-based strategies, but we have to become more cognizant of what the other hurdles are that we also have to factor in. So this publication, we have tried to look at for the first time, how the challenges posed by conflict, climate change, and the cumulative impact of COVID-19, and the demographic shifts, and show you what is the kind of scale of impact that these, as we often call within UNICEF, and now it's pretty well, it's an important narrative for all of us. What is the impact of the 3 Cs on many of the development outcomes that we're looking for? So you will see some interesting figures around challenges presented by the conflict, climate change, and COVID. And my last point, of course, is that there is hope, because we have seen progress, and in each region we can see there are countries that are, and this is the important point. It's really outperforming the average pace, and that's what we need to figure out. It's not a slow incremental changes that we want, but we want to be able to see how can we have a multifold increase in the pace, and the countries that have done it are showing progress in varieties of contexts. We should have the chance to reflect what's happening there in these countries and see what we can learn from each other, and what of those elements can we apply locally. But for these insights like these to be possible, investments in data is absolutely critical, particularly the use of reliable and statistically robust data that come from nationally representative households, and we are able to really do this kind of very cross-sectoral and multivariate type of analysis across many variables, because we have the basis of a strong household survey programs like the Demographic Health Survey and the UNICEF-supported multiple indicator cluster survey that assure a level of representativeness and quality that is absolutely critical. So needless to say that as part of also looking at the strategies for changing the pace, we also need continued investments in data collection and statistical capacity, so that there is a continuous process by which the national authorities and partners at the local level and national level can be best informed by the ongoing insights that we can, through increased data collection and analysis, and with backed up by good, strong statistical capacity. So as I wrap up, we are now in 2023 looking at these estimates. We will be producing in 2027, in 4 years' time, the next global estimates. But what I really hope that in these 4 years' time, we see a level of change which we can celebrate come in 2027. So I wish us all the very best, and look forward to hearing your reflections and recommitting ourselves to this very important goal of ending child marriage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vidya, and thank you for already highlighting the connection between the findings and the implication of these findings for advocacy and programming. It's very exciting to see the participation on this webinar. We have colleagues and participants from all over the world. It's an opportunity for us really to come together and reflect on what these findings mean for all our respective areas of work. Now, without further ado, I want to start giving an overview of the findings coming from the publication, starting with, of course, with some basic numbers on the magnitude of the problem. So how common is child marriage? Does it occur around the world? What are the latest numbers that we can use for our advocacy and programmatic efforts? So as this graph shows the distribution of number of child brides across the world. And this number is currently stands at 640 million. So this includes girls who are currently girls already married in their childhood, as well as women who are no longer in their childhood, but were married when they were still below the age of 18. Nearly half of child brides continue to live in South Asia. To be precise, South Asia is currently home to 290 million child brides, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, where 20% of all child brides live, and then East Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, and then, of course, the rest of the world. So in terms of global distribution of the number of girls and women married in their childhood, South Asia continues to have the most significant part of the problem. Also in light of the fact that, of course, we have in this region very populous countries where child marriage has been historically very common. Let's now dig a little bit deeper into this global distribution of what we call the burden of child marriage through this bar graph that shows, again, the number of girls and women who were married or in union before the age of 18 by country. And as you can see, in India, 1/3 of all child brides globally continue to live. So India alone accounts for 1/3 of the world child brides. And this is, again, a reflection of two elements combined: a significant population of girls and women who live in this country, combined with a high prevalence of child marriage. The share of India in terms of child bride is actually equal to the next 10 countries combined, which include Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, Nigeria, Brazil, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Mexico, Iran, and Egypt. And again, all these 10 countries have both those factors that I mentioned earlier, meaning a significant population of women, but also a significant problem of child marriage, with the exception in this list of China, where the prevalence of child marriage is relatively lower, significantly actually lower than other countries listed here. And then the remaining 192 countries cover the last third of the child marriage burden. So as you can see, the distribution is not an equal distribution because there is a concentration of the problem in certain parts of the world. So unless these high burden countries, and also, of course, the high prevalence countries that might have a smaller population, unless these countries significantly change the trajectory and accelerate progress towards ending child marriage, the world will not be able to achieve the ambitious goal of ending child marriage by 2030. Now, let's go into some consideration and some numbers related to the progress that has been achieved up to today and across generation, with a particular focus on who benefited from this progress, because indeed progress has occurred. It has occurred over a long period of time. It's not something that was achieved overnight, but there has been an acceleration of progress, particularly over the last 10 years. So in the last 25 years, we want to look at a longer historical perspective. We now estimate that 68 million child marriages have been averted. So if we think the time frame since around 1997 until 2022, approximately 68 million child marriages have been averted. So imagine 68 million opportunities and girls that have been spared from becoming child brides at a very young age. Now, of course, we have to take into consideration that these 68 million child brides have been averted at different times. So the peak of the change of the progress has occurred essentially in the last 10 to 15 years. This is where you can see in this graph, you have the part in pink or light purple. Well, these represent the number of child brides that have been averted. And of course, the dark purple are the actual observed number of child brides that have happened. So which was very stable up to, let's say, around 2009, and then has started to decline. In all of this, unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic took a toll and slowed down progress. And as you can see, this is indicated here with this peak that we can see in this area of purple with the purple and white. It's estimated that the COVID pandemic alone has been able to offset the declining trend. And in 2022, in this last year, an estimated 12 million girls became child brides. Many of you might have heard this 12 million number in the past, but actually 12 million was up to around again, approximately 2009. After that, the number was going down. The number reached below 10 million at some point, but unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the number went back up. And of course, it's with the recognition that the full impact of the pandemic is yet to be measured. Because as we know, during the pandemic, data collection was disrupted, and also because it takes a couple of years at least, if not more, for data to come in, also in light of the way in which child marriage data are collected, which refer to the past lived experience of young women and adolescent girls. So there is always a little bit of a time lag by the time the marriage occurs and the time the data are collected. So we have to take into consideration that between these two events, there can be a few years in between. So we are only going to be able to have an actual count of the possible impact of the COVID-19 pandemic only a couple of years from now. So we had to model the possible impact, and this is the estimates that we are presenting in this graph. So let's now look at the regional variation in this progress, because it's true that child marriage has declined steadily in the world, but most of the progress has been achieved in South Asia. So as you can see here, we have the prevalence of child marriage in 3 different points in time: 1997, 2012, and 2022, represented by these 3 dots of 3 different colors across the different regions. So let's take the example of South Asia. In 1997, the prevalence of child marriage in South Asia was at about, here we have displayed here, 60%. So 60% of young women in 1997 had been married by the age of 18. Now going to 2012, these levels already become below 50%. And then if we look at the data for 2022, we are now a little bit above 20%. So as you can see, a dramatic change between 1997 and 2022. The prevalence of child marriage went from about 60% to a little over 20%. Dramatic change in the prevalence of child marriage in this country, in this region, mostly due to the progress that we have seen in India, but also Bangladesh and Pakistan have made progress as well. Let's look at other region, however, and we can see that even from this very quick look at the graph, the other region, the dots are much closer together, meaning that there has not been such a dramatic progress. Starting from Sub-Saharan Africa, where we see that in the eastern and southern part of Sub-Saharan Africa, there has been some change. The prevalence of child marriage was a little bit over 40% in 1997. Now it stands at around 30%. But progress in Western Central Africa has been much slower. And as you can see, is represented by the 3 dots being very close together. And now I want to also pay attention to the other regions where child marriage is less common, but yet these regions have been slow in making progress, starting with Latin America and the Caribbean, which over a period of 25 years, we do not see progress happening. There has been no change in the prevalence of child marriage in this region, with the understanding that, of course, in this region, child marriage takes a slightly different form, is mostly comprised of informal unions, yet girls find themselves in positions of vulnerabilities, and therefore is still a significant issue that needs to be tackled. And last but not least, I would like to pay attention to the other three subregions of Middle East and North Africa, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and East Asia and the Pacific. Across all these three regions, there was some change between 1997 and 2012, but over the last 10 years, in these three regions, there has been no significant decline. And unfortunately, this happens in contexts where we are approaching the last mile, so where child marriage becomes very concentrated among certain populations, either because of their socioeconomic background or because of the nature of their lived conditions. They may be refugee populations or living in areas affected by conflict. Well, among these populations, sometimes child marriage becomes very hard to end because they are minorities and they are hard to reach population. Well, across these three regions, that's what it looks like is happening. Now we are at the hard to reach level. The low hanging fruit have gone. Now it's really about reaching the most vulnerable girls. And this is where you normally see there is a slowdown of progress at times. So just to say that across all regions, then this is a reminder that as we continue to work in high prevalence contexts, we do not have to forget those regions where the practice is concentrated, because otherwise we will not be able to fulfill the universal ambition of ending child marriage for our girls. And then in my last slide, I just want to reflect again to this principle of ending child marriage is a world goal, it's a universal obligation, and all girls need to benefit equally from progress. Well, the historical analysis that we conducted continue to indicate that the progress that we have seen so far has primarily benefited girls from the richest family. So this graph shows the prevalence of child marriage in 1997 and in 2022, divided depending on the socioeconomic background of the girls. Specifically, these are wealth quantiles. And we have two bars. The dark blue bar is the prevalence of child marriage among the poorest, and then the pinkish bar is the prevalence of child marriage among the richest girls. And as you can see, in some regions, both these lines go down. South Asia is one of such regions. Progress has been seen among the poorest and among the richest. It is true, however, that progress among the richest has been even faster, has been extremely, extremely fast. Yeah. So the poorest girls have benefited as well. The prevalence has gone down, but not as fast. But what is particularly worrisome is that in certain regions, we see opposite trends. We see the prevalence of child marriage actually increasing in West and Central Africa among the poorest women and declining among the richest. And similar trends are also seen in Eastern and Southern Africa. Other regions saw a sort of stagnation among the poorest and an improvement among the richest, and this is the case of Latin America and the Caribbean and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So again, we really have to consider who is benefiting from progress and how we make sure that we do not leave behind the most vulnerable girls. Also because later on, they become those hard to reach population that might lead to a stagnation of progress. So this is an important graph, and we really want to put the emphasis on, as we consider the best strategy to eliminate child marriage, we really have to take into consideration the socioeconomic dimension, which we know is a key determinant for child marriage, triggers marriages to begin with. And of course, if we want to eliminate child marriage, particularly among the poorest population, we need to think about transformation at the societal level that lifts people out of poverty through a number of different measures. But of course, this is going to be the object of our conversation later on, how to tackle the child marriage and how to learn from these findings. And now I want to hand over the floor. I want to give the floor to Colleen for the second part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm Colleen Murray. I'll continue on in the presentation of the rest of the findings today. So in this last segment of the presentation of the data, we'd like to take a look at the future and think about whether the world is on track to end child marriage, and along that path towards ending child marriage, what challenges might come in our way. Now, overall, if we look at the global trend, as Claudia had mentioned, there has been a decline in the practice over time. Here we're looking at the prevalence of child marriage in the last 25 years, which is represented by this solid line. You can see that the overall prevalence has declined from 25%, so about 1 in 4 girls marrying in childhood, now to today at a level of 19%, about 1 in 4. And if we were to continue along this trajectory, we can see, if we follow this dark pink line, this is what the future would look like if we sort of continue along with the same rate of progress that we've seen. This would bring us to a prevalence of child marriage of 16% in 2030. So a continued decline, but certainly not zero, which is the target for the SDGs. In total, progress would need to be about 20 times faster what we've seen in the last 10 years in order to bring us to a prevalence of 0 by 2030. So that represents an incredibly substantial acceleration, and really kind of illustrates how much faster we would need to pick up the pace in order to reach this very ambitious target of ending child marriage by 2030. We can also take a look and see not only at the share or the percentage of girls who would be marrying in childhood, but also what this means in terms of looking at the absolute number of girls affected. So we can see these are projections from starting from 2023 going to 2030 that show us if we're to continue at the current pace, what's the projected number of girls under 18 who would marry per year, and how are those girls distributed around the world? We can see that it's starting at the beginning of this graph on the left-hand side. This is where we're standing today at close to 12 million girls marrying per year as of now. And given the decline that we are projecting to see, we could see that this number is expected to go down to around 9 million per year by 2030. So again, a decline, but certainly not zero. We also see a couple of interesting things, I think, if we look at the regional distribution of where are these girls in the world. So where is progress happening more quickly and less quickly? Maybe perhaps starting from the bottom of this chart here, we can see pretty clearly here that in sub-Saharan Africa, even though there have been slight declines in the prevalence of the practice over the last 10 and 25 years, the population in this region is projected to continue growing quite quickly. And so the total number of child brides, this means, is not going to decline, but is actually projected to increase. So in contrast to the global trend, we expect that sub-Saharan Africa is actually going to see an increasing number of child brides in the coming years, which is quite a concerning pattern. This means, I think, that given the demographic projections that we see and that the population is expected to grow, that really there's an added level of urgency in that region to bring down levels of the practice more quickly in order to spare more girls from experiencing the practice. Looking at some of the other regions, though, I think there are also some interesting things to point out. First, we can see that South Asia is really the only region where there's a real visible decline in the absolute number. Again, South Asia has made great strides in the past decades in reducing child marriage, and this also is reflected in the absolute number going down as well. And this is really driving, the global trend. In contrast here, when we look all the way at the top of the graph here, we see that in many regions, the absolute number is, projected to be quite consistent over time. So we're not seeing really, narrowing slices of this chart. And this represents the trend, I think, that Claudia had shown earlier, that, that these are the hardest to reach. And if we continue in the future, what's happened, in the past 10 years, this sort of brings us at a continued pace and a continued, consistent number of girls who will be marrying in childhood per year. Here you'll see we have also included the estimated impact of COVID-19. As Claudia mentioned, this is based on some modeled estimates, since we don't have true data yet on the impact of the pandemic. But we do, we have projected that over the course of the decade between 2020 and 2030, that there are about 10 million additional girls who will marry in childhood because of the conditions introduced by the pandemic. Now, looking at this projection a slightly different way, we can instead of just looking at the next 7 years between today and 2030, we can also think about, if we were to just watch this trend continue, all the way into the future, how long would it take to end child marriage if we continue at the current pace? And of course, I think the corollary question to that is, are we willing to wait that long? At the current pace, we see that the world is at least 300 years away from ending child marriage, which of course is an incredibly long time. Based in this finding, of course, the global target can't be met until child marriage is eliminated everywhere. So we're looking here at each of the regions of the world and seeing, how long would it take in each one of the regions to eliminate progress. And when we look at regions like West and Central Africa, Eastern and Southern Africa, we see that the date on the timeline when child marriage would be eliminated at the current pace is hundreds of years away, certainly way too far into the future. There are other regions that we show down at the bottom of the chart here, at the bottom of the timeline, where we see that actually these are regions that have not made progress in the last decade, and so we can't even project a moment at which they would eliminate child marriage, because if their trends continue, they would continue at the same level as they are today. So there's not even a moment that we could say that it would end, unfortunately. Looking at the more positive side, though, of this, as Vidya mentioned in her opening, we do see that there are reasons for hope and there are positive examples that we can learn from. So in each one of the regions of the world, we've shown not only the year where the region would end child marriage at their current pace, but also what could happen if the entire region accelerated to the pace seen in a country that's making excellent progress. So in West and Central Africa, for example, the region could eliminate child marriage in less than half the time if they accelerated to the pace seen in the Gambia. And each region of the world has positive examples like this. So it again, I think, reinforces the fact that progress is possible in all kinds of settings. Now, to close, we wanted to add some reflections about the particular challenges that lie ahead in the efforts to end child marriage. We know that in today's world, there are the conditions of the polycrisis that include these ongoing overlapping crises that can create risky conditions for girls in several ways. And so these will include things like, pandemics, public health crises, protracted conflicts, natural disasters, or other climate change induced events. And there are many different types of crises that we can think about. Often they create conditions that have a similar kind of channel of impact. So these are things that, for different types of reasons, could all do things like interrupt a girl's education and pull her out of school. They could do things like create an income shock for the family that might, create pressure for the family to make a choice like marrying off their daughter. So different types of conditions that kind of can all increase the risk of child marriage for in the end similar types of reasons actually. So there are three factors that I'd like to share. The first, which is one that we've already mentioned in the presentation, that we have estimated that there will be 10 million additional child brides over the course of the decade beginning in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, this is mostly because of the impact of school closures during the pandemic, but also, an interruption in services, income shocks for certain families, death of parents, a few other factors. In addition to the pandemic, another area of concern or areas affected by conflict, we have included in this publication a new estimate of the relationship between conflict and child marriage that was produced based on looking at historical data over time. So looking at in the past, countries experiencing conflict, have there been an impact on levels of child marriage at the time the conflicts were happening? So sort of taking a really global look, really long-term look, and trying to come up with a relationship between the two. We did find that, in fact, there is a relationship between conflict and child marriage historically. And in quantifying that, we can say that for every 10-fold increase in conflict deaths, which is a measure of how intense the conflict is, we see a 7% increase in child marriage. And this could be, again, through different channels of impact, things like sense of insecurity, threats of sexual violence, infrastructure failures, and other channels. With a similar approach to the conflict analysis, we also took a look at historically how has climate change and climate change driven events had an impact on child marriage, and found again that there is in fact a relationship between these two things. In the analysis, the climate shocks in this case are defined as events where there's a deviation in rainfall, so either too much or too little rain. And we found that for every 10% increase in climate shocks, there is a 1% increase in child marriage. So, again, a relationship there. We see that in cases like, flooding and drought, that these events can have an impact on girls through things like disrupted sources of income, food insecurity, strains on resources, and other channels. So I think looking ahead, the projections that we've shared show that the pace of progress that we've seen to date is there is progress happening certainly, but it's not fast enough to meet the SDG target. And then in addition to sort of the general need to pick up progress, there are some particular challenges ahead that we need to keep in mind that really, I think, intensify the call to accelerate efforts. So with that, I'm going to close the presentation of data, and I'd like to hand over now to my colleague Namkali, who's going to offer some reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And thanks to you and Claudia for a wonderful presentation. Thanks to Vidya for convening this. It's always so good to be able to hear, the data from your side and from the almost 200 people online today. I can tell that there's lots of enthusiasm and engagement, and just want to send a reminder to everyone that please do share any questions, clarifications that you have in the Q&A so we can be able to pick that up. But before we get onto the Q&A, which I have the honor to be able to facilitate, I'd just like to quickly go through, so what are we going to do about it? Really grateful for all the analysis that both Claudia and Colleen do in terms of what the situation is today. And I think it's particularly pertinent this year as we head towards kind of the SDG midpoint and start to reflect about, how it is that we can be able to accelerate and do more, do faster, and learn from the things that we've done well. So linked to that, I just want to share with you that Archana, one of our colleagues, has shared a link to the publication online or in the chat box. So please feel free to reach out to that, but which also talks about what it is that we've learned, what the evidence is showing about what works. So just to ensure that, in case anybody hasn't had the chance to be able to look at that, here are a few things that we know that work today in terms of being able to address child marriage. And here are things, that we've learned over time, and perhaps now that we have these 7 years to go forward, we can be able to quickly pick up on, be able to do them at scale and in an accelerated manner for us to, somehow get to that elimination point. So number one, the publication talks about, the importance of inclusive economic growth and investments in gender-responsive social protection to address poverty as a driver of child marriage. So really countries who have inclusive economic growth, like India, like Ethiopia, have really shown progress in this area. And there's something there for the rest of us to be able to learn from. We've also learned that we need labor market policies that encourage decent work for women, and we need investments in quality secondary education to ensure that there are other viable alternatives to child marriage available to girls. So when we've gone out into the communities, as I'm sure many have who are on this webinar today, we hear from communities, we hear from parents talking about the lack of viable options. And so one of the things that we definitely know that does work, and in countries who have shown progress, is being able to have those viable alternatives. But that's only an option if girls have, a level of education which can be able to opt into those type of options. And for us, we're talking about not just secondary education, but quality secondary education. We also know that we need to support girls who are already married, giving them access to information and to services, so that they can be able to make the best out of their lives and to grow up into productive citizens, and not just for themselves, but also for their daughters and sons as they come forward. And finally, we know that we need to challenge the harmful gender norms and unequal power relations. At the core of child marriage, of course, is an issue of gender equality. And unless we're able to challenge these norms and the unequal power relations, we are not going to be able to address the issue. And so we need to be able to do that. So we address the context where child marriage is upheld by gender inequality and by traditional gender norms, limiting girls, to not only be seen as future wives and mothers, but so much more. Now, it would be amiss of me not to be able to mention, I think a number of you know that, yes, my name is Nakali, and I'm the coordinator for the global program that's implemented by both UNFP and UNICEF. This program is generously supported by the governments of Belgium, Canada, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, the UK, the European Union, and Zonta International. And I can see that some of those representatives are on this call today. So just want to take a minute to be able to show our gratitude to you. While we've talked about what it is that could be able to work at macro level through this program, which is the largest global program to address ending child marriage, we've also made significant results, not only through UNFP and UNICEF, but through a broad range of partnerships, including Girls Not Rights, who I'm aware are also on the call. So for example, at the end of 2022, we had provided life skills training or comprehensive sexuality education to over 21 million girls across 12 countries. We'd also managed to engage close to 59 million community members in dialogues on ending child marriage and supporting gender equality. We know that service points are important, and so we've supported up to 40,000 service points to provide adolescent girl-friendly education, health, and protection services. I'm going to stop here because I know we have many other results which are going to come up in our upcoming annual report. But now I want to take a minute and ensure that our time doesn't run out, so we can be able to hear, great questions from field colleagues across the different partnerships. It's been, so good to be able to see all the people who've logged in. So colleagues, if I might turn to you, you've heard a lot from us. It's now our time to be able to hear from you. I know Claudia and Colleen have been saying that in the background, they're looking at responding to some of the questions that you have, but we'd also like to be able to hear your voices. So if you're there and you would like to be able to put your hand up, please do. We'd love to not only be able to read out your question, but also to be able to hear voices from the field and respond, to any questions that you have in terms of the data. So maybe I can pick up one, and Claudia and Colleen, I'm going to direct this to either one of you. I know each region content has got a different context from the findings. What are some of the common contributing factors, or even different factors for that matter, in terms of increment or reductions in child marriage? There's also a question in there about the evidence of a significant relationship between child marriage and HIV. Claudia, I think you've done some work around that some while ago. What is the relationship to conflict-affected communities? Maybe let's start off with that round. And then the last one, apart from demographics, what other factors could explain an increase in child marriage in sub-Saharan Africa? Would the effects of climate change or conflict also play a role in this? Can I hand over to Claudia and Colleen just to start off with that set, please?
Thank you so much, Nankali. Let me take a couple of questions and then I'm going to give Colleen the floor to come in. It's $1 million question to understand what triggers child marriage and what prevents child marriage, of course. And this is the question that we all have to try to address. So we know from the analysis of the high-performing countries that these high-performing countries have a set of characteristics in common. These are countries from high prevalence countries like Bangladesh to low prevalence countries like Rwanda. They all seem to have a couple of things in common. They all have gone through significant transformations when it comes to guaranteeing employment opportunity for women. And I'm not talking about vulnerable employment. We are talking here about stable employment and decent work opportunities. These countries have also made significant progress in providing access to secondary education for girls. It's not just about primary education. We know that education becomes significant when it comes to its association with child marriage at the secondary level. After 10 to 12 years, there you can see that the prevalence of child marriage dramatically decline. These are also countries where there have been improvement in terms of poverty reduction and investment in inclusive economic growth that facilitate sectors like, for instance, the agricultural sectors where most of the poor continue to rely on. And then, of course, this goes hand in hand with changes in attitudes and social norms. And sometimes changes in norms follow changes in realities. So it's not just you change the norm and then you change the reality. Sometimes it's the reverse as well. So these countries have these elements in common. Of course, the opposite question is why certain regions have not seen progress. Well, if we think about, for instance, the sub-Saharan context, and particularly the Sahel, this is where the highest prevalence of child marriage is found in Africa, in the regions of the Sahel, spanning across a number of countries, but particularly concentrated in the central Sahel. In certain parts of the Sahel, the prevalence of child marriage is close to 90%. And these are regions where it's a combination of climate and conflict. And of course, these issues have been persistent over a number of years. So of course, I mean, there is not an answer that can satisfy everybody because of course we know that the conditions are different. But if there are no improvements when it comes to poverty reduction, when there is no improvement when it comes to access to secondary education and quality employment, and no changes in the social norms, of course, these are some of the reasons why progress has not been made. And before I give the floor to Colleen, I just wanted to react to the comment about what do we know about the prevalence of child marriage in conflict or fragile contexts. In addition to what I mentioned about the Sahel, we have calculated the prevalence of child marriage in fragile contexts, and it's twice the prevalence of child marriage that we have in non-fragile contexts. So there is clearly a combination of factors in these realities that increase the risk of being married in childhood for girls. And now I'm going to hand over the floor to Colleen for answering additional questions, and we also can make reference to the ones that are popping up in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I see that she actually has answered quite comprehensively on a couple of these questions that have come up about the reasons for change and about the reasons for continued challenges in sub-Saharan Africa. I did see a couple of particular technical questions, which I can quickly address about the way that the prevalence and burden are projected and measured. The projections that we show here they do not take into account additional indicators, additional variables. They are strictly a projection of what would happen in the future if the rate of change seen in the past were to continue. And in the case that we combine that with the population to show the burden, it's simply the prevalence, which is the percentage, applied to the population to show us what does that percentage mean in terms of number of girls affected. Thanks, over.
Thanks so much, Colleen. Let me look at and thanks so much for picking that up. Colleagues, as I'm looking at the questions that have been posted, I also saw a question around whether Africa has a regional strategy. Just to say, the African Union Commission has a campaign which serves as a strategy for ending child marriage. That's coming to an end this year. It has been evaluated, and so there is a move now to be able to address the next Africa continental strategy, which might be titled in the same way as the campaign. I think it shows great will for the African Union. We not only have the campaign, but also in the development strategy for Africa, the 2063, child marriage has also been identified as a development priority for African states as well. So in terms of the political will, the willpower to respond to child marriage within the African continent, I think it's at its highest when it's identified under Agenda 2063, the Africa that we want. But just moving back again to look at the questions, let me quickly review. And thanks so much, Colleen, for responding on the issues around, the demography. There was one question though, Colleen, about, is this about UNICEF specific? Excuse me, please. I'm just quickly rushing to it because I thought that's one thing that we really need to be able to. Are the definition and calculation of the burden based only UNICEF? Colleen, could you please respond to that?
Sure, of course. So the way that the prevalence of child marriage is measured is based on a standard globally accepted definition, which is the SDG indicator. And so that's the percentage of women aged 20 to 24 who were married or in union before they were 18. Now, that prevalence measure is used for global reporting and is, UN-wide certainly. When we combine that with a population and create the burden number, we're using population data that also comes from the UN Population Division. And so we're using official estimates of population and just kind of expressing the prevalence in a different way. So not what percentage, but what number. So it's a UNICEF calculation that follows the guidelines and uses the data of the UN overall.
Thanks so much, Colleen. Another question that's also there, was there any outstanding country in the low prevalence regions that showed significant decrease? This would be useful for the countries that are transitioning from high prevalence to low prevalence in the last stretch.
Thanks. Yes, there are some examples. I think Rwanda comes to mind, Indonesia comes to mind, Maldives is another one that has made great progress in really getting very close to zero. I'd like to share in the chat, just share with all the attendees a report that we published a couple of years ago that really does a deep dive on 10 different countries that have made great progress over time, because it includes a variety of examples. It includes the cases like India, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, where you have a large population and a traditionally pretty high level of prevalence that has now come down to a more moderate level. But it also includes examples of these lower prevalence countries that have continued to make strides, and a couple of examples of countries that have managed to make equitable progress, which is especially rare. So I'll pop that link into the chat so that you can take a look at some more details about those countries in particular.
Thanks so much, Colleen. Colleen, a final question to you, which I'd raised before, but it was about looking at the linkages between child marriage and HIV prevalence rate. I know we've done some work on that a while ago, but are you able to respond to that, or we can share the publication later?
Yeah, we can share some information perhaps in the roundup afterwards. I think there are certainly factors to consider, right? That girls who are in marriages are, exposed to frequent sexual activity, often with a partner who's older than them. So there's certainly a risk there. For similar reasons, this is why we see that levels of adolescent pregnancy are mostly concentrated, within marriages, right? A lot of the early childbearing that happens within marriage. So we can share some more resources on that after.
All right, thank you so much. We're coming on to the last 2 minutes. Vidya, I see you've got your video on. I just wanted to know if maybe there's some final words that you'd like to share before we close up.
Maybe we give 30 seconds to somebody, Rifat or some who said he raised his hand to say. Maybe we give him the
excuse
floor.
me. Let me quickly just check and see who's raised their hand up. Rifat, please do come in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the floor. I just want to raise hand because Nankali was saying that you want to hear some voices. So that's why I just raised hand instead of putting in the chat box. No, I mean, since I'm from Bangladesh and you gave a number of examples from Bangladesh, and it's a success story. Yeah, probably successful compared to many other African countries, but certainly we are not yet there to eliminate child marriage, as you all know. I think there are a couple of possible options that you just mentioned, economic growth and some others, but probably one big areas that probably Bangladesh has done well is building individual and collective agency of girls. Individual and collective agency of girls, because there are so many examples that girls collectively have averted child marriage in their locality, and that really made a lot of difference, so that the parents, the duty bearers, they have also heard the girls' voices. So I think that's also important beyond the other things that you have just mentioned. So I think that's one that we need to appreciate that thing. Secondly, some policies is not helping, I would say, because there are good policies, but that doesn't always work. But I think there are some proxy measures like social protections beyond secondary educations that also, and many of the social protections that you have done has a sort of gender responsive and adolescent friendly mechanisms or focus, which also probably have contributed to some extent in those changes that we have made.
Thank you. Thank you so much. One of the things that we're always open to is to learning what works in different contexts. We certainly share what works at global level, but really good to be able to hear about what the learnings are from Bangladesh. So thank you so much for sharing that. Colleagues, I know that other people have also got their hands up, but unfortunately we've run out of time. And so just want to thank again Claudia and Colleen and ask Vidya if there's any final words that she'd like to share before we come into a close.
No, I just want to really thank everyone for the very thoughtful comments, both in terms of queries to know more about what works, but also offering solutions that have worked, and also but contextualizing that. So this was very, very helpful and rich dialogue, and we very much appreciate it. And that's what I really want to close today's presentation on. This is all about partnership. It's all about learning. It's all about experience sharing, and it's about being open about what works and what doesn't work. And that happens, and I'll end with that we have to continue to get better at not only investing more in collecting the data, but also using the data so that you create the insights that you need. So all the best to all of you and to all of us. Partnership is key, and localizing the impact of that partnership is what will get us the results, and we can do it. So all the best to everyone.
Thank you so much, Vidya. Thanks so much to everyone. Please do look out for the link for the publication. It's been shared in the chat box. You can see it through our social media platforms, so be on the lookout for that. And yes, the presentation will be shared, plus the recording as well. We've also seen a lot of requests for that. So let's stop here for now. Thank you so much. Have a great day for those who are just starting off the day, or have a great evening for those who are closing off for the day. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.